Tyler Brooks stood in the center of the Grand Convocation Hall, and he had never felt smaller in his entire 14 years of life. The floor beneath his feet was made of something that looked like crystal but felt warm to the touch, and it stretched out in all directions like a frozen ocean. Above him, the ceiling disappeared into darkness so complete that Tyler couldn't tell if the chamber even had a roof. Around him, arranged in circular tiers that rose up and up like the inside of a massive stadium, sat the representatives of 1,000 different worlds. Tyler tried not to stare at them, but it was impossible not to notice the differences. There were beings made entirely of what looked like living metal, their bodies reflecting the blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. There were creatures that floated in spheres of liquid, their tentacles pressing against the transparent walls of their containment units. There were things with too many legs and things with no legs at all. There were species that looked almost human except for the wrong number of eyes or fingers or the skin that shifted colors like oil on water. But none of them compared to the figure on the throne. Queen Esikathara sat at the far end of the chamber on a seat carved from a single piece of black crystal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She was enormous, easily 12 feet tall even while seated, and her body was covered in overlapping plates of deep purple chitin that looked harder than any armor Tyler had ever seen. Her head was angular and predatory, with a jaw that could probably bite through steel, and from that head stared 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows of 3. Each eye was a different color, ranging from gold to silver to a deep crimson that made Tyler think of blood. She wore no crown, no jewelry, no decoration of any kind except for a single white scar that ran from the top of her skull down across her face and disappeared beneath the collar of her dark robes. Tyler had learned from the guards who brought him here that Queen Esikathara had ruled the Andromeda sector for over 400 years. She had conquered 47 different species, not through diplomacy or treaties but through war. She was a veteran of something called the Consumption Wars, though no one would explain to Tyler what that meant. She was, according to every source he could find, the single most dangerous individual in this entire region of space. And right now, all 6 of her eyes were focused on Tyler's chest. More specifically, on the metal that hung there. It wasn't much to look at really. Just a simple bronze star about the size of Tyler's palm, suspended from a faded blue ribbon that had probably been bright once but had dulled with age and handling. The metal was tarnished in places, and there was a small dent on one of the star's points where Tyler had dropped it once when he was 12. On the back, if you looked closely, you could see an inscription, but the letters were so small that most people never noticed them. Tyler's fingers wanted to reach up and touch the metal, a nervous habit he'd developed over the last 2 years, but he kept his hands at his sides. The guards had been very clear about that. Stand straight. Keep your hands visible. Don't make any sudden movements. Don't speak unless the Queen addresses you directly. And absolutely, under no circumstances, show any sign of fear. That last one was proving difficult. The Queen's clawed hand rose slowly, one long finger extending to point directly at Tyler's metal. The claw was as long as Tyler's hand and looked sharp enough to cut through bone. I have seen conquerors wear diamonds, Queen Esikathara said, and her voice was like rolling thunder, deep and resonant and somehow coming from everywhere at once. I have seen warlords display entire galaxies of honors, medals that covered their chests from shoulder to shoulder, each one representing a world conquered or a battle won. She leaned forward slightly, and Tyler heard the scrape of her claws against the armrests of her throne. Yet you, she continued, and those 6 eyes seemed to bore straight through him, a child with no military rank, no noble title, no army at your command, you were only this single piece of metal. This tarnished, unremarkable bit of bronze that any craftsman could produce in an afternoon. The chamber was so quiet that Tyler could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could feel the weight of 1,000 stares pressing down on him from all sides. Somewhere to his left, one of the floating tentacle creatures shifted in its liquid sphere, and the sound seemed as loud as a thunderclap. Explain yourself, human, Queen Esikathara commanded, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was not a request. Why do you wear that metal? Tyler took a breath. His throat felt dry and his legs wanted to shake, but he forced himself to stand straight. He'd practiced this. He'd known this moment was coming ever since the Queen's guards had found him drifting in the escape pod near the edge of restricted space. He'd had 3 days to prepare, 3 days to think about what he would say if the Queen asked him this exact question. But now that the moment was here, all those practiced words seemed to vanish from his mind. He looked up at Queen Esikathara, at those 6 predatory eyes that had probably watched countless beings beg for their lives, and he found his voice. It came out quieter than he'd intended, but it was steady. That was something at least. It belonged to my sister, Your Majesty, Tyler said. The words seemed to echo in the vast chamber, carried by acoustics that Tyler didn't understand. Her name was Amy Brooks. He saw something flicker across the Queen's face, some subtle shift in the way her eyes narrowed or the way her head tilted ever so slightly to one side. It was the expression of a predator that had spotted something unexpected, something that didn't fit the normal patterns of prey behavior. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees. Tyler saw movement in his peripheral vision as some of the alien dignitaries shifted in their seats. A being that looked like it was made of living stone leaned forward, its glowing eyes fixed on Tyler with sudden interest. One of the Crow warriors, a 7-foot-tall creature covered in bone ridges and scars, made a sound like grinding gravel that Tyler's translation implant identified as an expression of surprise. Queen HFY remained perfectly still for a long moment, those 6 eyes studying Tyler with an intensity that made him feel like he was being dissected and examined piece by piece. Then, slowly she settled back into her throne, her clawed hands resting on the armrests in a posture that Tyler's instincts recognized as the Queen preparing to listen. "Continue," she said, and though the word was a command, there was something else underneath it. Something that might have been curiosity or respect, or perhaps simply the attention of an ancient warrior who sensed a story worth hearing. Tyler touched the metal on his chest, just once, feeling the familiar shape of the bronze star beneath his fingers. And then he began to tell the story of Amy Brooks. Tyler met Queen HFY's gaze without looking away, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered that this should terrify him. Those 6 eyes had watched empires fall. Those claws had torn through battle armor that could withstand plasma fire. But right now, in this moment, Tyler wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about Amy, and when he thought about Amy, fear seemed like a small and distant thing. "My sister's name was Amy Brooks," Tyler began, his voice carrying across the silent chamber with a clarity that surprised him. "She was 21 years old when she died. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained for combat or anything like that. She was a civilian medic on a colony called New Perth." Tyler saw some of the alien dignitaries exchanging glances, their various appendages moving in ways that his translation implant struggled to interpret. New Perth was a small colony, barely worth mentioning in the vast scope of galactic politics. It was a mining settlement on the edge of human-controlled space, the kind of place that most people had never heard of and never would. New Perth had about 12,000 people, Tyler continued, his hands clasped loosely behind his back in a posture he'd copied from a documentary about military protocols. Most of them were miners and their families. There were about 3,000 kids living there, including me. I was 8 years old at the time. He paused, gathering his thoughts, trying to put the events of that day into words that would make sense to beings who had probably never experienced anything like human fear or human desperation. 6 years ago, the Vrex Raiders came. They didn't send a warning. They didn't make demands. They just appeared in orbit one morning and started landing their ships. One of the Crow warriors in the 3rd tier made a rumbling sound that Tyler's implant translated as a growl of recognition. Apparently, the Vrex had a reputation even here in the court of Queen HFY. "The Vrex take slaves," Tyler explained, looking briefly at the Crow warrior before returning his attention to the Queen. "They raid colonies on the edges of civilized space, places that don't have military protection or planetary defenses. They take anyone they can catch and sell them to whoever will pay. The rest they kill just because they can." Tyler's voice remained steady, but his fingers had gone cold. He'd told this story before to grief counselors and Commonwealth officials and the psychiatrist his aunt and uncle had sent him to after his parents died. But he'd never told it in front of an audience like this, and he'd certainly never told it to someone like Queen HFY. "The colony had one working spaceport," he continued. "Just one. And when the Vrex landed, everyone ran for it. Parents grabbed their kids, miners dropped their tools, teachers abandoned their classrooms. Everyone was running, trying to get to the evacuation shuttles before the raiders reached the port." Tyler could still remember that day with perfect clarity. The sound of the alarm sirens wailing across the colony. The smell of smoke from the burning buildings on the northern edge of the settlement. The crushing weight of adult bodies pressing around him as thousands of people tried to funnel through the spaceport gates at once. The sound of his own voice screaming for his parents who were somewhere else on a different shuttle, and he didn't know if they were alive or dead. "Amy was there," Tyler said, and he had to pause for a moment to make sure his voice wouldn't break. "She was helping load children onto the last shuttle. She'd been working a double shift at the medical center when the attack started, and instead of running for safety, she went to the spaceport to help with the evacuation." Queen HFY's primary eyes narrowed slightly, and Tyler saw her claws flex against the armrests of her throne. The last shuttle was almost full, Tyler continued. 347 children were on board, packed in so tight that some of them had to sit on the floor. Amy was supposed to be on that shuttle too. She had a seat reserved because she was medical personnel. But then, Tyler's hand moved to the metal on his chest without him consciously deciding to do it. The bronze was warm from his body heat, and the familiar weight of it grounded him. A little girl came running through the gates, he said. She was maybe 6 years old, crying for her mother. The pilot was screaming that they had to launch immediately because the Vrex had breached the outer perimeter. Everyone was yelling and panicking, and this little girl was just standing there, lost and terrified. The chamber remained absolutely silent. Even the beings who had been fidgeting or adjusting their positions had gone completely still. Amy picked up the girl, Tyler said, his voice quiet but clear. She carried her onto the shuttle and put her in the seat that was supposed to be Amy's. And then she stepped back off the shuttle and ran toward the blast door controls. He saw Queen Esikathara's head tilt slightly, a gesture that might have been confusion or might have been the beginning of understanding. The spaceport had emergency blast doors, Tyler explained. Big heavy things made of reinforced steel, designed to seal off different sections in case of a hull breach or a fire. But they'd been damaged in the initial attack. The automatic systems weren't working. Someone had to operate them manually from the inside. Tyler's throat felt tight, but he pushed through it. Amy knew what that meant. If she went to those controls, if she stayed behind to seal the doors and buy time for the shuttle to launch, she wouldn't be able to get out. The controls were deep inside the spaceport structure, too far from any exit. Once those doors started closing, she'd be trapped. One of the floating tentacle creatures made a sound like water rushing through pipes, and Tyler's implant translated it as an expression of sorrow. He didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Queen Esikathara, on those 6 unblinking eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. She did it anyway, Tyler said. She ran to the controls and she wasn't alone. 17 other people went with her. Teachers, miners, shopkeepers, a retired engineer, a cafeteria cook. None of them were soldiers. Most of them had never held a weapon in their lives. But they all made the same choice Amy did. Tyler could feel the attention of the entire chamber focused on him now, a weight that was almost physical. The Vrex were coming, he continued, his voice growing stronger. 200 raiders, armed with plasma weapons and combat armor. And Amy and those 17 volunteers held the spaceport against them for 43 minutes. He heard gasps from several different species around the chamber, sounds of disbelief and shock that needed no translation. 43 minutes, Tyler repeated. They had no weapons, no armor, no military training. Just maintenance tools and whatever they could find. Welding torches, power wrenches, cargo containers that they used as barricades. Tyler's hands had clenched into fists behind his back, but his voice remained steady. They sealed section after section of the spaceport, falling back each time the Vrex broke through, buying seconds that turned into minutes. Every door they sealed gave the shuttle more time to power up its engines and clear the launch zone. Every corridor they held meant the children on that shuttle had a better chance of surviving. He paused, and in that pause the silence of the chamber felt like a living thing. The shuttle launched, Tyler said quietly. All 347 children made it out alive. They escaped because Amy Brooks and 17 other people who weren't soldiers and weren't heroes decided that a stranger's child was worth dying for. Tyler's hand pressed against the metal on his chest, feeling the dent on one of the star's points. All 18 volunteers died when the Vrex finally overran their position, he said. The Commonwealth recovered their bodies 3 weeks later when a military fleet retook the colony. They were found at the final blast door, still holding their positions. And this metal, he lifted it slightly, letting the light catch the tarnished bronze. This is what the Commonwealth gave to Amy's family. The Bronze Star of Compassion. The lowest civilian honor they award. Because Amy wasn't a soldier. She was just human. Tyler's hands were still clasped behind his back, but his fingers had started to tremble slightly. He took a slow breath before continuing, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before but somehow carried even more clearly through the vast chamber. There's a recording, he said, and several of the alien dignitaries leaned forward in their seats. Amy's communication badge kept transmitting even after the command center lost contact with the spaceport. The Commonwealth military recovered the data when they retook the colony 3 weeks later. Tyler paused, his eyes unfocused as if he was looking at something far away, something only he could see. I listened to it once, he said. Just once. On my 13th birthday. My aunt gave me the medal that day, and she told me that if I wanted to hear Amy's voice one more time, The recording was available in the Commonwealth archives. She said I should think carefully before I decided to listen to it, because some things, once you hear them, you can't unhear. Queen Esikathara had gone perfectly still on her throne, and Tyler noticed that her claws were no longer flexing against the armrests. She was listening with the complete focus of a predator, but there was something else in her posture now, something that looked almost like respect. I listened to it anyway, Tyler continued. I put on the headphones in the archive room and I pressed play, and I heard my sister's voice for the first time in 5 years. Tyler's voice caught slightly, and he had to pause to steady himself. When he spoke again, his words were measured and careful, as if he was picking his way through a minefield of memory. She was crying, he said simply. The whole recording, from the moment she reached the blast door controls until the very end, she was crying. I could hear her breathing, fast and panicked, and I could hear the sound of her hands shaking as she worked the manual override switches. One of the beings made of living metal made a sound like wind chimes in a storm, and Tyler's implant struggled to translate the emotion behind it. Grief, maybe, or empathy, or something that had no direct human equivalent. She kept saying, "I'm sorry," Tyler said, his eyes still distant. Over and over again. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." At first I thought she was talking to the other volunteers, apologizing for being scared when they needed her to be brave. But then I realized she was talking to herself. She was apologizing for being afraid, like being afraid was something to be ashamed of. Tyler's jaw tightened and he blinked several times rapidly. There were other voices on the recording too, he continued. Kevin Chin, he was a history teacher at the colony school. He was there with Amy at the controls and I could hear him trying to calm her down, telling her to breathe, telling her they were doing good, that the kids were going to make it. And there was Jennifer Walsh, she worked at the mining equipment depot. She was singing something, I don't know what song it was, but she was singing to keep herself from panicking. The chamber remained silent except for Tyler's voice, and even the species that couldn't understand human emotional nuance seemed to grasp the weight of what he was describing. The recording is 43 minutes long, Tyler said. 43 minutes of Amy crying and apologizing and working those controls while the sound of weapons fire got closer and closer. You can hear the Vrex Raiders in the background, their voices and their footsteps, and you can hear the volunteers falling back, sealing one door after another. Tyler's hand moved to the metal on his chest again, his fingers tracing the shape of the bronze star. At the 38-minute mark you can hear the shuttle launch, he said. There's this massive roar of engines and someone, I think it was Kevin, shouts that they did it, the kids are away, they're safe. And Amy just keeps crying and working the controls because there are still 5 more minutes of recording left. One of the Krau warriors in the third tier shifted in his seat, and the sound of his bone armor scraping against stone was like thunder in the quiet chamber. Tyler glanced at him briefly, then continued. The last door took 3 minutes to seal, he said. It was damaged worse than the others and the manual override kept jamming. You can hear Amy and Kevin arguing about it on the recording. Kevin wanted to run to try to find another exit, but Amy said no. She said if they didn't seal that door, the Vrex would have a clear path to the landing pads, and they might be able to shoot down the shuttle before it cleared the atmosphere. Tyler's voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, but in the perfect acoustics of the chamber, every word was clear. So they stayed, he said. And they worked that jammed control system while the Vrex got closer and closer, until you could hear individual raiders shouting in their language, until you could hear the sound of their weapons hitting the door on the other side. He paused, and when he spoke again there were tears on his face, but his voice remained steady. And then at the 42-minute mark something changed, Tyler said. Amy stopped crying. Just stopped. And she started laughing. Several species in the chamber made sounds of confusion or surprise, and Queen Esikathara's secondary eyes widened slightly. Not hysterical laughter, Tyler clarified quickly. Not the laughter of someone who's lost their mind. It was real laughter, genuine and warm, the kind of laugh I remembered from when she used to visit us before the attack, when she'd play games with me and my parents. Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a quick gesture that he tried to make subtle but everyone saw anyway. The door finally sealed, he said. You can hear the massive crash as it locked into place, and then Amy's voice, clear as anything, saying, "We did it. Kevin, we actually did it." And Kevin, he sounds exhausted and terrified and relieved all at once, and he says, Yeah, we did." And then Amy says. Tyler's voice broke slightly and he had to pause again. When he continued, he was speaking so quietly that the beings in the upper tiers were leaning forward, straining to hear. She says, "At least the kids get to grow up. That's worth it, right? That's worth everything." And Kevin agrees with her. He says, "Yeah, Amy. It's worth it." And then Amy laughs again and she says, I hope they do something amazing. I hope they cure diseases and explore new worlds and fall in love and have families and do all the things we won't get to do. I hope they make it count. The silence in the chamber was so complete that Tyler could hear his own heartbeat. He looked up at Queen Ezekethera, and he saw that all 6 of her eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow wasn't. That's where the recording ends, Tyler said. The Vrex breached the final door 20 seconds later. There's a lot of weapons fire, a lot of shouting, and then nothing. The badge stopped transmitting. All 18 volunteers were killed in less than a minute. Tyler's hand pressed against the metal one more time, and then he dropped his arm to his side. I need to tell you something else, Your Majesty, he said, his voice stronger now. Something I haven't told many people. Queen Ezekethera inclined her head slightly, a gesture of permission. Amy Brooks wasn't my sister, Tyler said, and he heard gasps and murmurs ripple through the chamber. Not by blood anyway. My parents were colonists on New Perth. Amy was a medic who volunteered there for 6 months as part of her medical training. I met her exactly 3 times before the attack. 3 times. She smiled at me once in the medical center when I came in with a scraped knee. She waved at me in the market. She said hello to my mother once outside the school. Tyler saw several of the Crow warriors lean forward, their massive bodies tense with attention. I was one of the 347 children on that shuttle, he said. I was 8 years old and I was clutching my stuffed bear, crying for my parents who were on a different transport, and I had no idea who Amy Brooks was or what she was doing. I didn't know she'd given up her seat. I didn't know she was sealing the doors. I didn't know she was dying so I could live. His voice grew stronger with each word. I found out later, after the Commonwealth retook the colony, after they recovered the bodies and reviewed the recordings. I found out that Amy Brooks, a 21-year-old woman who barely knew I existed, had chosen to die so that I, a stranger's child, could survive. Not because I was special. Not because I was her family. Not because she owed me anything. But because when it mattered, when the choice was between her life and mine, she decided that a stranger's child was worth saving. Tyler looked directly at Queen Ezekethera, meeting all 6 of her eyes without fear. That's why I wear this medal, Your Majesty, he said. Not because Amy was my sister by blood. But because she chose to be my sister when it counted most. Queen Ezekethera rose from her throne, and the sound that rippled through the chamber was unlike anything Tyler had ever heard. It was a collective gasp that came from 1,000 different species, each expressing shock in their own way. The being made of living metal produced a sound like a bell cracking. The floating tentacle creatures sent waves crashing against their containment spheres. The Crow warriors made deep rumbling sounds that shook the crystal floor beneath Tyler's feet. In 400 years of rule, Queen Ezekethera had never stood for anyone who was not her equal in power or status. She had received emperors and war chiefs and ancient beings whose lifespans stretched across millennia, and she had remained seated on her throne for all of them. But now she was rising, her massive form unfolding from the black crystal seat, and Tyler had to tilt his head back to keep looking at her face as she descended the steps. Each step was deliberate and slow, her clawed feet making no sound on the crystal stairs despite her enormous weight. Tyler's instincts screamed at him to back away, to run, to do anything except stand there as this apex predator approached him. But he forced himself to remain still, his feet planted on the warm crystal floor, his hands at his sides. The metal on his chest suddenly felt very heavy. Queen Ezekethera reached the bottom of the steps and continued walking until she stood directly in front of Tyler, so close that he could see the individual plates of chitin that covered her body and the way her 6 eyes moved independently of each other as they studied him. She was so tall that Tyler had to crane his neck to look up at her face, and he realized with a strange detachment that one of her clawed hands could probably wrap entirely around his torso. "Why do you wear it?" the queen asked, and her voice was different now, softer somehow despite its depth and power. "Why not your parents? Why not displayed in a museum where millions could see her sacrifice and remember what she did?" Tyler met her gaze, all 6 eyes at once, and he found that the fear he'd felt earlier had transformed into something else. Not bravery exactly, but a kind of clarity that came from knowing he was standing in front of the most powerful being in the sector and the only thing that mattered was telling the truth. "My parents are dead, Your Majesty," Tyler said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice was. "They died 2 years after the attack. The doctors said it was complications from an illness, but my aunt told me the truth when I was older. They died of grief. Their hearts just gave out. They couldn't carry the weight of what happened anymore." Tyler saw something flicker across the queen's face, some subtle shift in the arrangement of her features that he couldn't quite interpret. After my parents died, I went to live with my aunt and uncle, he continued. They're Amy's parents. They adopted me, gave me a home, made sure I had everything I needed. They're good people. They love me. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to the medal on his chest. But they couldn't look at this, he said, lifting the bronze star slightly. Every time they saw it, they saw their daughter. They saw the choice she made and the life she lost and the future she would never have. It was too much. The medal sat in a drawer for 4 years, wrapped in tissue paper, hidden away where they wouldn't have to see it. Tyler's fingers traced the edge of the star, feeling the familiar shape of it. On my 12th birthday, my aunt gave it to me, he said. She came into my room early in the morning before my uncle was awake and she put this box on my desk. She told me that Amy would have wanted me to have it, that I should be the one to decide what to do with it. Keep it, donate it to a museum, bury it in the garden if I wanted. She said it was my choice. Queen Esikathara tilted her head, and Tyler saw her claws flex slightly, a gesture that might have been unconscious. I wore it that same day, Tyler said. I put it on and I haven't taken it off since, except to sleep and shower. I've worn it every single day for 2 years. But why? The queen pressed, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice now, not just the command of a ruler demanding answers. A museum would preserve it. Scholars could study it. Thousands, millions of beings could learn about what your sister did. Why keep it hidden on your chest where only you and those close to you will ever see it? Tyler took a breath, gathering his thoughts. This was the part that mattered, the part that he needed to get right. Because I don't want people to remember Amy as a hero in a museum, he said carefully. I don't want her to be a story or a legend or some perfect example of human courage that people look at and think, I could never do that. He saw confusion on some of the alien faces around the chamber, but Queen Esikathara remained focused on him with unwavering attention. The recording I told you about, Tyler continued, the one where Amy was crying and scared and apologizing for being afraid, that's the real Amy. That's who she actually was. Not some fearless warrior who never felt doubt or terror. She was terrified. She wanted to live. Tyler's voice grew stronger as he spoke, more confident. Amy had plans, Your Majesty. She was going to finish her medical training and go to university. She wanted to specialize in pediatrics because she liked working with kids. She had a boy she liked back on Earth, someone she'd known in school, and she was going to visit him when her volunteer term on New Perth was finished. She wanted to see the oceans on Europa. She wanted to try real Martian food. She wanted to do 1,000 ordinary things that ordinary people do. He paused, and when he continued, his eyes were bright with unshed tears but his voice remained steady. She was 19 years old, Your Majesty. Not 21 like I said earlier. I got that wrong, I'm sorry. She was 19. Barely an adult. She should have had her whole life ahead of her. Tyler's hand pressed against the metal, feeling the warmth of the bronze through his shirt. I wear this because I want to remember that Amy wasn't special, he said, and he heard gasps from several directions in the chamber. She wasn't born brave. She wasn't trained for heroism. She was just a regular person who happened to be in an impossible situation, and when that moment came, when she had to choose between her life and a stranger's child, she made a choice. Queen Esikathara's 6 eyes had narrowed, and Tyler could see her processing his words, turning them over in whatever ancient mind existed behind that predatory face. True strength isn't about never being afraid, Tyler said, his voice quiet but clear. Amy was afraid. She was so scared that she couldn't stop crying. She was so terrified that she kept apologizing for feeling fear, like fear was a weakness or a failure. Tyler looked up at the queen, meeting her gaze directly. But she did it anyway, he said. That's what I want to remember. That's what this medal means to me. Not that Amy was perfect or fearless or superhuman, but that she was afraid and she did it anyway. That she wanted to live and she chose to die. That she had dreams and plans and a future, and she gave all of it up for a child she didn't know. He could feel the attention of the entire chamber focused on him now, but he kept his eyes on Queen Esikathara. When people see this medal in a museum, they see history, Tyler said. They see something that happened in the past, something distant and removed from their own lives. But when I wear it, when I feel the weight of it against my chest every single day, I remember that Amy's choice is still relevant. It still matters. Because every day people face choices. Maybe not as dramatic as the one Amy faced, but choices about whether to help someone or walk away, whether to stand up or stay silent, whether to be kind when it's difficult or take the easy path. Tyler's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, but in the silence of the chamber, everyone heard him clearly. I wear this medal because I never want to forget that when my moment comes, when I face my own impossible choice, I want to be like Amy. Not fearless. Not perfect. Just brave enough to do the right thing even when I'm terrified. Just human enough to believe that a stranger's life is worth protecting. Just strong enough to choose love over survival. He paused and then added quietly, "That's true strength, Your Majesty. Not the strength to never feel afraid, but the strength to be afraid and do it anyway." Queen Ezekethera stood perfectly still for a long moment after Tyler finished speaking, her 6 eyes fixed on the human child before her. The chamber remained in absolute silence, as if every being present had stopped breathing at the same time. Tyler could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could feel the weight of the metal against his chest, could sense the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. Then Queen Ezekethera, supreme ruler of the Andromeda sector, breaker of fleets, she who consumed the Dravath Empire, conqueror of 47 species, did something that no living being in the chamber had ever witnessed. She knelt. The sound that erupted from the assembled dignitaries was like nothing Tyler had ever heard. It was shock and disbelief and awe all mixed together, coming from 1,000 different throats in 1,000 different ways. The being made of living metal produced a sound like a massive gong being struck. The floating tentacle creatures thrashed in their spheres, sending waves of liquid splashing against the transparent walls. The Krau warriors roared, their voices shaking the crystal floor. But Queen Ezekethera ignored them all. She lowered herself slowly and deliberately, her massive form descending until one knee touched the crystal floor. Her head bowed forward, and those 6 predatory eyes that had watched empires fall were now looking up at Tyler Brooks, a 14-year-old human child who wore a tarnished bronze medal. Tyler's mind went blank. He couldn't process what he was seeing. Queens didn't kneel. Rulers didn't bow. Apex predators didn't show submission, especially not to prey. This violated everything he understood about power and hierarchy and the natural order of things. "Your Majesty," Tyler stammered, his voice cracking for the first time since he'd entered the chamber. "You don't have to. Be silent," Queen Ezekethera said, but her voice was gentle, almost kind. "Let me do this." And then, before Tyler could say another word, movement erupted throughout the chamber. The Krau war chief in the 3rd tier rose from his seat with a crash of bone armor, his massive form towering over those around him. He descended the steps with heavy footfalls that echoed like thunder, and when he reached the main floor, he dropped to one knee with a thud that Tyler felt through the soles of his shoes. The Nethros ambassador was next, a being so ancient that its crystalline body had started to develop fractures from age. It moved slowly, its body creaking and groaning, but it made its way down from the diplomatic tier and lowered itself with a sound like breaking ice. Then came the Felkos delegation, their small furry bodies rushing forward in a wave. Then the being made of living metal, moving with the sound of grinding gears. Then the floating tentacle creatures, somehow making their containment spheres bow in midair. One by one, every species in the chamber rose from their seats and descended to the main floor. The proud and the humble, the warriors and the scholars, the predators and the prey. They came in a flood of different shapes and sizes and colors, and every single one of them took a knee before the human child who wore a simple bronze medal. Tyler turned in a slow circle, his eyes wide with disbelief, watching as the entire grand convocation hall filled with kneeling figures. There were beings here who had conquered star systems. There were species who had fought wars that lasted for centuries. There were creatures whose strength could tear apart starships with their bare appendages. And all of them were kneeling. "I don't understand," Tyler whispered, and he realized his face was wet with tears. "Why are you all?" Queen Ezekethera's voice cut through the commotion, and instantly the chamber fell silent again. "I have ruled for 400 years, she said, her head still bowed, her eyes still looking up at Tyler. "I have conquered 47 species. I have commanded fleets that could destroy planets. I have fought in the consumption wars and emerged victorious while billions died around me. I have stood on the corpses of my enemies and declared myself supreme." She paused, and Tyler saw something in her eyes that looked almost like shame. "But I have never," she continued, her voice dropping to something quiet and raw, "given my life for a stranger's child. I have never looked at someone I did not know, someone who meant nothing to my bloodline or my empire or my legacy, and chosen their survival over my own." The queen's claws dug slightly into the crystal floor, leaving small marks in the otherwise perfect surface. "Your sister Amy," she said, and Tyler heard genuine reverence in her tone. "She possessed a strength that I, with all my power and all my victories, have never demonstrated. She had something that cannot be conquered or commanded or trained. She had the ability to look at a stranger and see someone worth dying for. Queen Esikathra raised her head slightly, though she remained kneeling. "That is why we kneel," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "Not to you, child, though you wear her medal with honor. We kneel to the memory of Amy Brooks and the 17 others who stood with her. We kneel to the idea that a being's worth is not measured in their strength or their conquests, but in their willingness to sacrifice for others. We kneel because you have shown us what true strength looks like, and we are humbled by it." Tyler couldn't speak. He tried to form words, but his throat had closed up completely, and all he could do was stand there with tears running down his face while the most powerful beings in the Andromeda sector remained on their knees before him. After a long moment, Queen Esikathra spoke again. "Tyler Brooks," she said formally, "you came to my domain by accident, lost in space, alone in the dark. By rights, I could claim you as a citizen of my empire or send you to a processing facility to await transit home. But I will do neither of these things." She paused, and Tyler saw something that might have been a smile cross her alien features, though it was hard to tell with her facial structure. "What do you want, child?" she asked. "Asylum in my empire? Citizenship with full rights and privileges? Wealth beyond measure? A position of honor in my court? Name it, and if it is within my power to grant, I will do so gladly." Tyler wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself enough to answer. He thought about all the things he could ask for. Safety. Security. A guarantee that he would never have to worry about money or shelter or protection again. He could ask for power, for influence, for the kind of life that most people only dreamed about. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was much simpler. "I was traveling to Epsilon Prime Colony, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "There's a school there, a good one, where I'm supposed to start classes next month. My aunt and uncle arranged everything before the accident that left me stranded in space. I just want to get there. I just want to go to school and try to have a normal life. Can you help me with that?" The silence that followed Tyler's request was different from before. It wasn't the silence of shock or awe. It was the silence of beings who had expected grand demands and received something heartbreakingly humble instead. Queen Esikathra's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, and Tyler saw something that looked like respect deepen in her gaze. "You could ask for anything," she said slowly, "and you ask only for help reaching school?" Tyler nodded, his hand moving to the medal on his chest again. "Amy wanted to go to university," he said. "She wanted to learn and grow and build a future. I can't give that back to her. But I can try to do it for myself, to live the kind of life she would have wanted for me. That seems more important than wealth or power or any of those other things." Queen Esikathra rose to her feet in one smooth motion, and around the chamber, every other being did the same. "Then I will grant your request," she declared, her voice ringing with authority, "but not in the way you imagine. I will not simply arrange transport for you to Epsilon Prime. I will personally escort you there in my flagship, with full honors befitting one who carries the memory of such sacrifice." Tyler started to protest that such treatment wasn't necessary, but the Queen raised one clawed hand to silence him. "Furthermore," she continued, "I declare a new tradition for this court. Once per cycle, on the anniversary of the day we learned of Amy Brooks and her sacrifice, I will wear a bronze star in my court. Not a decoration of precious metals or rare gems. Not something that displays my wealth or power. But a simple bronze star, identical to the one you wear." She looked around the chamber, her gaze sweeping across the assembled dignitaries. "I will wear it to remember that true strength is not found in conquest or domination," she said. "True strength is a 19-year-old girl crying in a spaceport, sealing a door she knows will be her tomb, choosing the life of a stranger's child over her own survival. That is strength that I, with all my power, have never possessed. That is strength worthy of remembrance." The Queen's eyes returned to Tyler, and her voice softened slightly. "You will leave for Epsilon Prime in 3 hours," she said. "My staff will provide you with quarters on the flagship and anything else you require. And when we arrive at your destination, I will personally ensure that you are enrolled in your school with everything you need to succeed." Tyler felt overwhelmed, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper. She would have been amazed by all this. Queen Esikathra's expression softened in a way that Tyler hadn't thought possible for someone with such a predatory face. "Your sister was already amazing," she said gently. "We are simply recognizing what she already was." 3 hours later, Tyler stood on the boarding ramp of the Queen's flagship, the largest and most powerful vessel in the Andromeda sector. Behind him, visible through the massive windows of the departure hall, the Grand Convocation Hall still glowed with blue light. He could see tiny figures moving through it, dignitaries returning to their ships, warriors heading back to their barracks. But Tyler wasn't looking at any of that. He was looking at the medal on his chest, the simple bronze star that caught the light from the flagship's engines as they powered up for departure. His fingers traced the familiar shape one more time, feeling the dent on one of the points, feeling the warmth of the metal against his skin. "I'm going to school, Amy," he whispered, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Just like you wanted to. Just like we both dreamed about." The engines reached full power with a roar that shook the entire spaceport, and Tyler walked up the ramp into the flagship. Behind him, in the Grand Convocation Hall, Queen Izikathara stood alone before her throne, holding a simple bronze star in her clawed hand. She looked at it for a long moment, turning it over, studying the way the light reflected off its tarnished surface. Then carefully she pinned it to her robes, right over where a human heart would be. The entire Andromeda sector would remember this day. They would remember the human child who taught an empire what true strength meant. They would remember Amy Brooks and her impossible choice. They would remember that sometimes the smallest acts of courage cast the longest shadows. But most of all, they would remember that in the cold mathematics of the galaxy, where survival was everything and strength was measured in firepower and conquest, there existed something that defied all logic and reason. Something beautiful and terrifying and fundamentally human, the belief that a stranger's child was worth dying for.